So Tim and Daryl, remember Tim's a little bit older. He's 48, Daryl's 35. They've been married for 3 years. Daryl says that he has way more desire for sex than Tim does. They've talked about maybe having a consensual non-monogamous lifestyle as one of the ways to help them with some of the desire issues. They had coming out experiences that were traumatic for both of them, but also unique. So that is another area that will need to be processed with this. And Daryl's wondering a bit about his sexual orientation as well. So that is something that needs to be discussed. So the first area for Tim and Daryl that we're going to get into is the male hypoactive sexual desire disorder. So we would talk to both of them because I don't think that it's appropriate in this setting to separate the couple at this point and just talk about one person's the nature of their sexual desire. I want the couple to witness that with each other so that they can process along when I'm doing it with maybe the specific client. So I would want to do a lot of psychoeducation here just to get everybody on the same page. What are our expectations about sexual desire as men, or maybe as a gay man? Is that different than what your partner expects? Do you have the same kind of understanding of, maybe what it means when there's low sexual desire? Are you both interpreting that in the same way? And then going into the sexual response models. So hypoactive sexual desire disorder, to me, a lot of times just means this is someone who is not a spontaneous desire person. This is someone who is responsive to cues of desire, but they haven't totally figured out what the context is that is going to elicit that kind of desire for them. So it's hypoactive sexual desire disorder, but it's really because they don't know yet exactly where their sexuality lurks or the nature of their sexuality. And in this current context in the relationship, they're unable to find any receptivity or spontaneity to sexual cues. So I want to talk to them about that. See if maybe Tim and Daryl have different ideas about what their sexual response looks like. Maybe Tim is very much spontaneous and Daryl is very responsive, in which case we're going to need to talk about how to manage that. If we are talking to Daryl about hypoactive sexual desire, we're going to want to talk about the dual control model and start to get ideas about what turns him on and turns him off and what the context is in which he's more likely to be receptive to sexual cues or not. And so there's a self-exploration component of that, but there also needs to be communication that happens between the couple around that. We would also want to talk about what does good sex mean? What does good desire mean? What are we looking for here? How would we know that we're having good sex if it was happening to us? And another way to flesh out some of the sexual desire matters is by introducing them to the concept of closeness and separateness, and how they might be going about trying to get sexuality in the relationship a bit differently. And it's not quite landing with each other. One person wants a long day of being together and romance, and then maybe sexuality will emerge. And the other person would rather not see each other for the whole day and then come back and be excited to talk about what their day was like. And then that is going to spur them into sexuality. So we do a lot of psychoeducation around some of these concepts so that they can play around with them and construct what it means for them. So the next one for Tim and Daryl is looking at the desire and the arousal mismatch that they seem to have here. So again, we're going to go into psychoeducation around what arousal templates and love maps actually mean, and then start to construct that. So some of that might be around meeting each other's attachment needs, which might be part of the closeness and separateness dimensions for them. And I would really go into the pizza metaphor for Tim and Daryl as well. So not just for Rachel and Danny, but Tim and Daryl also need to explore their desires, what arouses them and what doesn't, and then be able to communicate it with each other, so that maybe they're more understanding of their own sexuality, which of course is going to help the other person understand it a little bit better. So we would be looking at trying to understand the nature of each person's arousal and what that actually then means for their partnered sexual experiences that are going to happen. We want to talk about who initiates here. So the expectation of who's going to initiate. It, in some ways, with same-sex couples, we don't have the same like baseball metaphor that heterosexual couples might, but that sometimes doesn't mean that it's easier or better. It might mean that it looks different. It might mean that there are a whole bunch of different ideas about initiation that are, people are coming up with on their own, rather than like cultural models around it. So who initiates? That's often a big question with couples when they're in there. What is the nature of initiating? What does it mean when I'm the only one who initiates? What does it mean when my partner says no consistently? At what point do I stop trying? And that's putting it into the EFT cycle of pursue, withdraw. So pursuing for sexual contact, the other person withdrawing from it and leaving the pursuer feeling that they have unmet attachment needs, as well as the withdrawer might feel unmet attachment needs as well, because they might be feeling attacked or criticized or pressured around the sexual component. So that cycle is often a big part of the initiation discussion and what that's actually going to look like. So for Tim and Daryl, what I would probably do is I would show them this video that I'm about to show you guys on sexual rejection, because we need to honor all members of the couple or partnership or whatever the configuration is. So we want to honor maybe the trauma of being able to say, of the difficulty in saying no. We want to give respect to that, as well as give respect to the other person's experience of rejection. Even though it might be completely intellectually reasonable and understandable, there might still be some emotional impacts on that. So we want to make sure that we're attending to both sides of it so that we can help the couples be able to process this. So let's just take a little, this is a little example of what might come about in therapy through a discussion of who initiates and what that looks like.
Johnny and his girlfriend Rachel weren't getting on well after 2 years together. There were lots of arguments, sometimes quite stormy ones. When one night Johnny smashed his fist through the kitchen door, a friend suggested he might try therapy. It felt odd at first to be in a room with a stranger who wanted nothing more than to listen to him closely. She asked what the fights between him and Rachel were about. "Oh, this and that," said Johnny. Was there anything else he was sad about in his relationship? Sad was a useful word to use. It made Johnny feel that his anger wasn't some kind of horrible madness, which was the vibe he tended to get from all other observers. His anger was coming from a place of weakness and inadequacy, which, crucially, the therapist could understand and not immediately judge him for. There was a lot of sadness around sex. Johnny and Rachel had been going for months without too much of it. Johnny would try sliding a hand over gently, but Rachel would subtly ignore him, pretending to fall asleep. The rejection was silently killing Johnny and was at the root of his increasing coldness and snappiness with Rachel. That must feel pretty painful to be turned down, said the therapist, in such a sympathetic way that Johnny, who was an ex-Marine, felt tears welling up. Johnny began talking of his childhood. He'd grown up in Texas and had never known his father. His mother had been beautiful, volatile, and an alcoholic. He'd always had a sense that he was a burden to her. He'd been a chubby boy, slow at school and shy at home. When he was 14, she'd left him in the care of her sister and had gone to live with a lover in Chicago. Johnny and his mother rarely saw each other now. Beneath Johnny's outward strength, not far beneath, was a sense he was unacceptable to the core of his being, unable to sustain even his own mother's interest. The feeling of self-loathing and shame was easy to reawaken, and Rachel's sexual disinterest played right into it. The problem was that Johnny wasn't good at translating his hurt into anything another person could understand, let alone sympathize with him for. We tend not to be endeared by people who call us rude words and break furniture, however vulnerable they might be feeling inside. Rachel had come to see her boyfriend as a bully, not a hurt, lost boy, though that was, beneath it all, perhaps precisely what he was. The therapist suggested something as basic as it was brilliant. Rather than trying and failing to have sex, Johnny should tell Rachel a little bit more about what it felt like to be him when his hand lay rejected, untouched by her in the bed. Most importantly, he had to stay calm when he explained himself to her, on the basis that, unlike when he'd been young, he now had agency and choice and a possibility of maturity. Put like this, Rachel understood at once. She didn't have some macho guy on her hands. She was picking up on echoes of a lost, scared boy, whom she actually cried for when it was explained to her like this. It wasn't that Johnny and Rachel immediately had sex all the time. Rachel's job often left her not in the mood, but the meaning of the lack of sex changed between them. Rachel understood how Johnny might interpret her tiredness and took steps to reassure him of her basic love for him. Johnny better understood why rejection had a habit of stirring up such uncontrollable hurt in him. Johnny gradually lost the old sense of helplessness. She isn't my mother, and I'm not a little boy at her mercy, he stated one day in therapy, and it felt like the most obvious and momentous of points. Johnny took on board what belonged to the past and what belonged to now. The therapy lasted over a year. Johnny and Rachel are going to be married soon. The School of Life offers therapy in person or over Skype. Click here for details.
The School of Life has a number of really good YouTube videos for sex therapy and all more general kinds of therapy as well. So if you ever want to look them up, they're pretty good. So the next area then around initiation to talk about is couples' sexual styles. So there are different styles of ways that couples end up starting sexual activity. And Angela is also going to make sure that she sends this, or not this image, but the research from Barry McCarthy on a couple of pages. He gave that out at the last S-Star conference, just over a year ago when he presented on this. So what he discovered in his clinical work is that there are 4 most common styles in which couples start sex. Doesn't mean that there aren't more. There's probably an endless kind of amount, but there are 4 most common ones. The first most common one, he said, is complementary. So complementary is I'm asking you what you want, you ask me what I want, and we kind of do a negotiation and a bit of a give and take. And that really reminds me of the pizza metaphor. It's this complementary process of both people being active in terms of asking for what they want and talking about what they don't want. And there's a real sense of equality in that complementary style. The next most common style is traditional gender roles, and how that, so this is heterosexual gender roles where sex is the man's domain, intimacy is the woman's domain. And so in this traditional style, it is the man's job to initiate and the woman's job to be the receiver. And so that is based on what our clients might have seen from parents, from families, from friends, from media, from TV. That this is kind of the style in which they do it. It's not women initiating. It's not women talking more about what they want and what they like. There's more of a power dynamic with this model or this sexual style. In my experience, I would actually say that this traditional gender role way of initiating and having sex is the most common one that I see. That's the one that I think is most prevalent in my practice. That's different than what Barry McCarthy has seen, because he said complementary was more common for him. So I just think that I see a lot more of this traditional sexual style, which has some advantages of, everybody kind of knows what the rules are. It's very role based. This is what you do if you're in this role and what you're in this role. But it doesn't leave a lot of flexibility for how the sexuality might go down, or certainly making sure that we are including the female perspective in what happens sexually. The third most common sexual style is the best friends model. So I'm best friends with this person, and that is our pathway to sex. When we are best friends, when we know everything about each other, when we're always together, that's where sexuality emerges. And so you could see a lot of closeness from Esther Perel's perspective being highlighted in this best friend model. And not surprisingly then, that the disadvantages of the best friend model is that it's hard to find someone so close to us as erotic because of some of the things that Esther Perel talked about, where there is no obstacle. Like with Larry David as well in the clip earlier, there's no obstacle for Cheryl to overcome. And that makes it maybe less likely that she's going to initiate. From Esther Perel's perspective, we need to have obstacle to elicit desire, because the obstacle is what we're trying to overcome, which gives us desire to overcome it, rather than almost like I don't have to overcome anything, it's available for me at any time. That doesn't make it that special anymore. It doesn't make it that meaningful. I don't really have to work for it. So the best friend type can be helpful for some clients, can also be a hindrance in terms of maintaining the eroticism over a long-term relationship. The last most common style is emotionally expressive, and that's like, couples that fight like cats and dogs and they screw like cats and dogs. So, lots of fighting, lots of high emotional expression, but they also express that through their sexual activities too. And so they might have very highly pleasurable, intense sexual experiences, but that's also part of what the rest of their life looks like too, very emotionally expressive. So when I introduce this to clients, so let's say Tim and Daryl, for example here, I'm going to ask them, what do you think your style is? What do you think your default style is? And what do you think your partner's is? Are you guys on the same page here? Is one person trying to have sex through a best friend's pathway and the other is trying to do it in a complementary way? If so, we're not on the same page. We're not working towards the same process. Similarly, if a male, let's say, wants to use the more traditional genderfied roles to go into sexuality, that might not impact someone who has a best friends model very well, because that might seem not very friendly and a little bit too much like there's a power differential or an authority dynamic there. So we need to talk about this with clients to see, well, what one seems to maybe fit for you by default? Which one have you tried before? Have you had different relationships where you encountered sexuality through different ways as well? And let's see what that means for you as a couple. So Tim and Daryl, what does this mean? If maybe you have different sexual styles, how do we figure out how to integrate that so that you guys are meeting each other sexually when you choose to? So that's it for the initiation part of Tim and Daryl. Initiation is a big component for sex therapy. The next one to go to with Tim and Daryl is on their idea around exploring consensual non-monogamous relationships. So in order to help them with that, I would probably provide them with this picture, the picture that Angela is sending that has more of the details about it. Like, this is our starting point. Where do you think you want to be? What components? What overlaps? What do you think? Let's just start a conversation on this. Let's explore it. And we'll talk about sexual response models as being a part of those preferences, and closeness and separateness, because there might be some needs for separateness that are exemplified in preference for certain kinds of relationships. There might be attachment dynamics that are also embedded in it, to help us make more sense of understanding maybe why we gravitate towards certain areas and not others, but also having the flexibility that we don't need to always understand exactly why that might be occurring. We just need to accept that it is occurring like that. And of course, the consent process being extremely vital to negotiate these kind of relationships. So this is where Marty Klein is going to spend a bit of time talking about some of the pitfalls of trying to navigate into consensual non-monogamy. And it's not totally comprehensive on the topic, but again, this is an introduction around how to navigate these issues with your clients.
Hello, this is Dr. Marty Klein with another video quickie. Today, I'd like to talk about mistakes that some people make when they're pursuing non-monogamy, polyamory, that sort of thing. Because polyamory is on many people's minds these days. While poly originally had a specific meaning, many people now use it to simply mean any variety of consensual non-monogamy. In the blogosphere, sexperts and other relationship activists promote poly as a viable option, which of course it is. But is it for everyone? No. In fact, an increasing number of my patients turn to non-monogamy as a way of fixing broken relationships. This is a strategy that frequently does not succeed. Like, our relationship doesn't work, let's add more people. Well, as you know, there's a continuing increase in the number of sexual orientations and sexual identities that people claim. Predictably, some folks are now claiming that poly is their orientation, as if this is supposed to settle all questions about their motives, responsibility, or decision-making. Whether we want to consider poly an orientation or not, and I don't think that doing so is very helpful, the fact that it might be an excellent alternative for this or that couple does not mean that it's a good idea for all couples, which is also true about monogamy, of course. Here are some of the fundamental mistakes that my patients have recently made in choosing or implementing poly. While there's nothing wrong with non-monogamy, each vignette provides a cautionary tale. Just because we want to legitimize poly as a relationship format doesn't mean that we should stop thinking clearly about what's necessary to make it successful, or Identify what elements guarantee failure. So let's take a look at a few. What I call grandfathering in an affair. Say, Jose has an extramarital affair with Sue. His wife, Martha, catches him. Jose announces, I realize I'm poly and I want to live that way. Please accept my relationship with Sue into our life. You know, there's little or no acknowledgement here of the betrayal or the resentment that Marta naturally feels toward the newcomer. There's no discussion about responsibilities or privileges. This clumsy way of creating poly rarely works. And then Jose gets to blame Marta for being closed-minded. Let's look at what I call imposing it on a partner. Indira and Ken have struggled with their desire discrepancy for years. Finally, Indira announces she has to have sex elsewhere. She says to her lower desire mate, look, now you can go and do what you want, as if he wants more sex. I'm going to, so go ahead. While I sympathize with her frustration, Indira might as well say, I'm abandoning you sexually. Non-monogamy is hard enough when two people created together enthusiastically. Regardless of the subject, no one likes to have their marriage hijacked by their partner saying, here's how it's going to be now. Let's look at two guys who tried doing it without clarifying the rules. Trey and Deshawn want to spice things up, so they decide to be poly, like some of their friends. But in their naive enthusiasm, they do it without seriously discussing rules, boundaries, or expectations. For example, is it okay for one of us to fall in love with someone else? Do I expect that we'll be with each other on our birthdays? Are there any things, sexual or non-sexual, that you'll do only with me? Talking about such details may be uncomfortable. Not talking about details like these ahead of time often leads to consequences that are very painful. And finally, underestimating the maintenance that non-monogamy requires. Pat and Parker have a history. They love each other, but Parker always wants to discuss his feelings in their relationship more than Pat does. When they opened their relationship, Pat assumed that Parker would talk with his new partners, giving Pat a break. But she quickly discovered that poly requires more talking between primary partners, not less. The challenges are many. Allocating each person's finite time, deciding about sleeping arrangements, dividing up each person's sexual energy. Sometimes there's jealousy to deal with. There's even the question of what to tell friends or the kids. Poly arrangements last about as long as monogamous ones, which is to say, they require continual attention. Like monogamy, satisfying poly needs thought, consistent care, self-awareness, and conversation. Being selfish, fragile, non-communicative, and conflict avoidant are bad for a relationship, regardless of its format. If you struggle to talk about your needs and frustrations, non-monogamy will not fix that. It'll simply highlight the problems that this deficit creates in a relationship. If you're hoping that non-monogamy will reduce your partner's desire to process your imperfect intimacy or sex life, you'll probably be disappointed. Of course, struggling together to meet the challenges of poly can enhance a couple's intimacy, expanding their life experiences and bringing sex to a new level, whether inside the couple or with other partners. Sexiness and enthusiasm are not the key predictors of successful non-monogamy. The key predictors are rather a solid foundation of genuine caring, realistic expectations, clear agreements that both partners embrace, and the willingness and ability to communicate no matter how difficult.
So Marty's emphasizing some of the pitfalls there that can happen. It doesn't mean that that consensual non-monogamy isn't the right solution sometimes for individuals and couples, but I think, from my perspective, we really can't rush into something like that. I don't want my couples rushing into something like that, because we really do need to understand what is the purpose of this. What is the purpose of thinking about adding other individuals or groups or partners into this space? What are we really doing that for? And if the answer is not is something that is around, there's issues in the relationship right now that this is hopefully going to compensate for, really have to make sure that the communication has already really been fully explored around those issues, so that we're not just kind of bypassing the real emotional issues that are occurring relationally and kind of avoiding it and going on to something else that really doesn't expose people to maybe those same kind of vulnerabilities when they would have to communicate with their partner. So I think that it's a wonderful option when it's appropriate for couples to be able to navigate, and that takes a lot of vulnerability and communication. So the last thing to talk about with Tim and Daryl is when Daryl mentioned that he's wondering about his sexual orientation. And this is something that I'm seeing quite frequently in my practice, is men who grew up in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and never had a safe way of exploring their sexual orientation because of how oppressive heteronormativity was for them growing up. So they were never able to even ask themselves the questions of, hey, do I like that? Am I interested in that? Would I want to see more of that? They had to really shut that down. So I find a lot of men in their 40s, 50s talking about, well, what is their sexual orientation? What is their sexual vocabulary as well in being able to navigate that? So that's Joe Court is going to talk a little bit about male sexual fluidity and talk about some of the language that we do use, because we want to make sure that when we're talking about it, we have a clear and consistent language.
Today, I'm going to talk about male sexual fluidity. And what we're talking about when we say that is that there are men who are not just gay and not just straight. There are men who are bisexual and everything in between, that we know that male sexuality can be on a continuum. Kinsey was right when he did his survey and found that there's from 0 heterosexual, opposite sex only, to 6 homosexual, only same sex only. There are people that are heteroflexible. There are men that are homoflexible. There are men that are fluid in that the context is what's important. So they're only attracted, let's say they self-identify as heterosexual, they're only attracted to women, but every once in a while, they can be sexual with another man. It doesn't generalize to other men. It's only this particular man in this context. Could also happen for gay men. They're only attracted to men, but every once in a while, someone can come around of the opposite sex and they can be sexual with that person. And again, it's context and person specific. So things are much more complicated than they used to be. When clients tell you that they're gay, straight or bi or whatever, lesbian, it doesn't tell you anything about their sexual history, and it tells you nothing about their current sexual behavior. You have to ask and you have to know. So we're hoping that you're going to be interested in some of our classes and our courses to learn more about sexual fluidity in general. But for this video, male sexual fluidity.
So male sexual fluidity is an interesting concept because in most of my training, I learned about how inflexible male sexuality was, that there were imprinting periods that happened, and that the sexuality of men was less malleable than it was for females. And as I reflect on that, I think that that might be more patriarchal impediments that are really in the way of men being able to explore their sexual fluidity or some of that variance. And that's a conjecture at this point, but I see a lot of this now coming out where men need to talk about this. What does it mean that I want to have sex with another man in this context, but I want to be married to a woman? How do I make sense of that? So a lot of guys that I work with, we spend a lot of time just talking about, you know, what do you think? how do we organize this? You know, what's your narration around this? How do you come to some kind of understanding or peace around what this might mean for you? So the recommended resources for Tim and Daryl. So Joe Court, as you just saw, he does a lot of really good work around male sexual fluidity. So his best book is My Husband Gay, Straight, or Bi? You know, really just trying to kind of normalize that men are not like just static or, you know, one and done with their identities. Contemporary Male Sexuality by Barry and Emily McCarthy would be a good one for them to read, to get more education, myth busting around male sexuality. And then if they're considering consensual non-monogamy, I might have them read The Ethical Slut, which is really a classic. More Than Two is another more recent one. There are some issues with that. One of the authors has not always, well, how do I say that? He's gotten into some trouble, and that may influence how you or your clients might read that book. Because of some of his issues, I still found the book like pretty good, and there is a website that has some other like PDFs and stuff for clients to think about some of the different issues around ethical poly.